This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And I wanted to say a sad thing is that the Rantoul Press, which has been going for many, many years, since the 1875 or something like that, it's a subsidiary of the News Gazette. It's retiring, and as are a lot of the subsidiary local papers that are owned by the News Gazette. The newspaper industry has lost out to the internet, and it's not all negative. It's very, very interesting to get a lot of the population into communicating with each other. So it's absolutely wonderful, but it's also been traumatic for newspapers. So the News Gazette has closed down. It doesn't print it here anymore. The buildings have been bought, and they're going to be gentrified. That it means developed. And so it's a whole different atmosphere. But Rantoul Press was run by the same people, the same family for many, many years. The Air Force arrived with the Chinook Air Force Base, and wow, they adapted and benefited. And then after many, many years in the 80s, the Chinook Air Force Base closed out, so they had to go ahead with that problem. That lasted a good 10 years. Gradually, the buildings were sold, and it became a local situation. Some of the big buildings were not occupied because they were just too big, and the roofs were not good. So, and that's still going on. There were theaters for force people. There were movie theaters as well as actual dramatic theaters. There were restaurants, big stuff. And it didn't always fit the new dimension of people coming in and using those areas. Some of the dormitories for service people did not meet code for living quarters, so they were demolished. And the fences which protected the Air Force Base were taken down, and it's been a big change in Rantoul. And now we have factories. One of the factories has a challenge with the virus because they have a lot of people together. But we will still hear about Rantoul because the person who's in charge will be with the News Gazette and will add commentary on a page within the News Gazette newspaper. And you can get the newspaper on the internet. So that's enough about that. But knowing about your community is rather important. It seems like not very functional, but always those people who have walking dictionaries of reminders about the community, going back through their families, back through other families, are always intriguing people. They have sometimes to think. They will stop, and you will almost want to finish a sentence, but the sentence will be a sentence that you would not know and you will benefit from. So I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership today because it's part of knowing each other. And but there are other things happening in the environment before we get into leadership. There's tomato season is coming to an end. That's kind of interesting. Tomatoes are around. Tomatoes have flavor. Uh, I this week went to the Champagne farmers market, and I was tempted to say, "You guys get rid of your seconds, your pockmark fruit and vegetables, and uh, ones that are cracked and whatnot." But one third of our fruit is like that, and vegetables the same way. And some of that uh, produce is antique varieties that you don't get in commercial agriculture. For instance, a tomato has to travel, so it has to have a strong skin. And an antique tomato might be very large and not very uniform. If you want to pack bananas, they all should have the same size. So I grew up with bananas, and we would buy or uh, get hold of the bananas that didn't pack well. You got the huge bananas, the ones that were together as twins, the ones that were too small, the ones that were too curly. So industry wants to harvest their crop all on the same day. They have a tenderizer, and they has little pins, and it gives you an idea of when the tomato is coming to ripeness. So it may be uh, 2 o'clock on the 4th of the month, and it's all harvested, the whole bush. Well, antique tomatoes ain't like that. They may be big, and they may be awkward shapes. They invariably are cracked across the top, and uh, they look ugly, but wow, are they flavorful? And they don't have those thick protective skins. Uh, uh, so I tend to uh, buy uh, pockmarked produce, and one third of our produce is that way. So now, if you are an organization that recognizes the value of the second grade material, you find ways of moving it to restaurants that can use it. Uh, now that is a problem because it's very good you got rid of it, or you're a family and you always eat your own pockmarked fruit and vegetables. And but I wanted to tell some of the people there that they should bring some second grade material, because if we only present them with ideal, smooth material that has not been checked on with a cricket and half eaten, they are teaching people to do just what we don't want them to do, which is to not only buy ideal, regular sized fruit and vegetables. So I think that was a surprise for thinking at some level, because in genuine manner, people have been moving that second grade material along in other ways. So it's silent. So the fruit and vegetables is all very nice and clean and tidy and in nice rows, and it all matches. If you go to a supermarket, you'll see these tremendous displays, and there's a water spray that sprays on them. It's very, very regular. But I think we need the people who sell produce to bring some of their seconds, so that they teach the population that the seconds are available and that they are good food and we'd like. So that's my spiel about tomatoes at the moment. I'm sad to see tomatoes go. At last, we're warming. The world is warming, so we don't have a frost already. But when the frost comes, you run out and pick all those green tomatoes and keep them for pickles. And so the family gets involved in pickling tomatoes and other plant other produce too, but particularly tomatoes because they're not going to survive a frost. Uh, all right, enough about tomatoes. I want to say something about leadership. I often say something about leadership, but the Prairie State Conservation Coalition has found an organization that uh, teaches people to perhaps be leaders themselves, perhaps give them some tools to not to be too afraid of doing this, and then to apply that to uh, a project. And these are three rather wonderful webinars. And the first one was on the individual. And the individual is often uh, a challenge. And I am reaching out for my notes. It's there's a feeling that the world has been run by leaders who have power. Like you have one king or one leader, and then everyone underneath that leader, down to the peasants, sorted out according to class, and they don't have too much say in the whole matter. It comes down from the leadership. If you go back to pagan times, you will find that the Scandinavians, believe it or not, especially the Danes, got very involved with this sort of leadership. They didn't really have a lot of leadership. They went into Europe and they were very destructive. They destroyed monasteries. They were not very in favor of religion. They had their own godlike organizations. They had small territories, but they knew how to build small ships and then later larger ships. And they went down into Italy, into Rome. They went into France and Spain. They went across the Channel to England. And the English had already been invaded by the Saxons that were coming through from France, but they were fairly well established. But then came the Vikings, and they settled on the East Coast, and then they went north, and they went south. They went to the Land's End. They went across to the Wessex, which is sort of the middle part of England. Mercia was a huge English colony in the 8th or 9th century after BC. And there was a commitment to church, there was, as well as to king. So the king was attached to godliness. And if you were Catholic, you were Catholic. If you were Protestant, you were Protestant. But the king came down by hierarchy. So if you had a son or a daughter, the son got to be the leader that continued. When the father died, the daughter got to be a nun or a cleric. uh, there was a hierarchy here, uh, and there was a sort of leadership, but it was somewhat destroyed by the Danes coming in and just taking over farmland, taking over cities, uh, entrenching themselves. First, they would stay for a little while and go back to home, but later they would start to live in these sites. And uh, there were uh, people who were kingly at the time and rather kindly and had large families. So there was always a question as to whether the elder brother got to take over. Sometimes a member of the family died, so that was passed over. Sometimes the member of the family was not able, so that was passed over. Sometimes the daughter was married to a king in another area, and so that gave strength to the organization. And sometimes there were people behind this that were perhaps the sixth son and quite willing to be a support to the elder son that would be the king. And this in uh, it was the Albert the Great, and he he stayed in his position as a supporter for many years and very cooperatively with his brother. And the brother had two children, but they were very young, and then the brother died. And almost reluctantly, uh, Albert took the throne. He had been very uh, forceful against Danes, and he had uh, leadership properties and followers. And uh, he managed to establish a central part of England as Wessex. And he had grown up in an era when even kings did not get well educated, and he realized his deficiencies. So he brought in people from uh, other places, whether it was France or whether it was England or Wales. I might even have been from Ireland, that was also where the Danes extended into Ireland. Uh, so he educated himself. He got to be able to read Latin, and he brought in art. And this was in an era when they had stopped the Danes to some extent and were recreating themselves. They were building their own organization. So he put forth a whole bunch of regulations that so if you murdered someone, there was a certain legal procedure and there was a punishment for that. And so this went through to all sorts of small uh, or peasant level, even slave level people. And there was a value put upon a person that might have been exterminated unwittingly or wittingly. And so a value was placed on that person. So if you were a bishop or a prelate or uh, an advisor to a king, then you might be valued more greatly than if you were a peasant doing a specific job. But even the peasant has a job to do. And uh, in that sense, the peasant is a leader in his own domain. So uh, I wanted to do that, to recognize that person and give him or her leadership qualities. And there was an equality to this. When it was wartime, the farmers were able to help, they would go. But if not, it would be decided by Moot that the farmer had to stay to produce the food that was needed by the army. So not everyone would go to war. So there was a sort of joint understanding of each person's leadership role and what they were contributing and a value put on their contribution. And that lasted while there was a war. But once peace came, there was not the same unanimity. The uh, the king had put together these documents, the rules of the game, but it was an era when not very many were educated or able to read. Their skills were verbal skills, and they weren't so willing to uh, be peaceful neighbors in the same way as they were peaceful warriors or backup. The king wanted to have uh, little castles here and there. They weren't castles; they were sort of forts where the locals could have a fort in case the invading Vikings could take over. And this was peaceful time, so there was kind of a reluctance to do that. Some places built their fort and used their rules. Other places, the fort got half built and then left, and in other places, the fort didn't even get built. So the king had a problem of bringing his rules and his excitement, his uh, education, and his art and architecture to the crowd. And we're faced with the same sort of situation in many cases. We may be functionally illiterate in some ways. So the thought amongst the people who are organizing leadership webinars are concerned about this. They don't want to inspire leaders that are going to be the staff sergeant that's going to shout at the troops. They're looking for that sort of leadership that has an overall goal so that 20 or 30 people or 2,000 people will know the overall goals, be part of putting them together, be part of implementing them, part of transmitting them to others. And how do we do that? So you get the impression that we need leaders who are CEOs who have a breadth of understanding. And what the webinar did was to get together the thoughts of what sort of things would you like to see in a leader. They had probably 20 or 30 things. What would you think? Is it stability? Is it honesty? Is it money? Is it knowledge? Is it ability to dance? Ability to emote? To love? So what are the three or four things that they came up with? And researchers have looked at this internationally, and The four that come up at the top of this retinue of titles was honesty. They would like to have an honest person. People who are not honest have a hard time remembering their dishonesty. They have to be very clever people to be able to do that. And it doesn't always work. The lie, the tiny lie that people would use sometimes is not a good indication that this would be a leader to take a whole process further, to cut corners, to uh, so the honesty is the first one, and uh, then the next one was you need to be competent. That means you need to know your trade, but you also need to know what you don't need, what you don't know. You need to be able to sense that this person knows his trade or her trade, but also knows what the limitations are. And then this person also knows that all those other people that are around who don't want to be a leader, but want to be a specific leader in their own particular domain. So that's why we have trades and people who can work on cars, or people who can dance, or people who can do postal work. Uh, so it's convenient to do this, but it's very helpful if the CEO can know uh, honesty, then also have the competence to know the trade. So if you're going to teach people how to farm, you need to know how to farm. You may not have to be behind a horse and plow to do it, but you need to know and understand. Uh, the next thing we were talking about was to be inspiring. That means you have to be willing to understand your helpers, your associates, to inspire them to go a little further than just do their job. That is inspiration. They have to think a little beyond. And the next one, which is fairly much related, is to look forward. So we would hope that the uh, CEO would spend at least a third or a half of his or her time looking around the world and finding what might be possible. What are we doing that's too regular that could save a prairie, for instance? What? How can we inspire our talent pool to be on the same wavelength? So that means creating strategic action plans. Some plans are 40 pages long for an engineer, or 2 pages long for a flyer to go out to friends and relatives. WEFT has been doing it very well for almost 39 years, and they're all mixed up as virus, just the same as everyone else is. So they have been working with Zoom, and Zoom meetings and artwork and fundraisers and WEF fests, all in remote. They now have a sign on Lincoln Avenue and uh, University Avenue which advertises for uh, WEFT. This is a grant put together quickly by Ed Hadley and a whole bunch of other people. But Ed has had the art skills. And so when there's a meeting of what shall we do and people don't know, they gradually work themselves out. They ask questions of each other and get to know each other. Uh, uh, Vicky has been chairing a lot of this and bringing people together, and they have to know whether to get a grant from the community or a grant from the state, like the Arts Council, or how to present their case as music contributors, where people who are expert in knowing certain genre can come together. And really, I respect WEFT for bringing people together. There's inevitably, it's not going to be the same thing for everyone. And there is compromise, but the compromise should be a non-compromise. It may be that with our prairie, for instance, it might be that someone who's uh, adjacent to a prairie that looks like weeds is very upset by it. But if you educate that person for years, perhaps even 15 years, uh, eventually they get the message that we're almost have an extinct ecosystem, and this is part of trying to preserve it. And then that person may become one of your best disciples. And we have usually a smallish clique of people. It's clique is not quite the right name. They're the friends and relatives that makes this work. You have to see it in virus time. Most people are uh, presenting from their office or their home, and Gina is there moving and shaking us. And in my case, we're talking to by Zoom to Urbana Public Television, and public television then sends the radio broadcast sound to Gina, and she puts it up on the broadcast opportunity. She puts in advertising, so little statements by various people who are contributing, and then that television that you're seeing right now, you're seeing my face, and it goes up on public television in Urbana twice a week. This week, it's been 6 weeks since we put any pictures into this, and it's really very helpful if you're going to say that big blue stem is a clump grass that falls over late in the season in a certain fashion, then a photograph is better than 1,000 words. So we got active, and we've been working at it to put up a television program that is more than me just speaking into a microphone. That is helpful. It's better than radio in some ways, but they're different languages. So Friday's program, because we're not exactly with it yet, will go up with a radio program with me speaking in radio terms. But the alternative has been to to go over. Our topic for the week was the prairie that's in the uh, detention pond on Second Street. So I then took a, a Banner public service television camera and attached it to a tripod, and the tripod was attached to a dolly, so I could roll around the walkways of the park. It's part a park, but its functional use is a big detention pond that'll hold water so it doesn't flood campus town uh, when there's a 8-inch rainfall. And other times it can handle trees and shrubs and a little prairie. Uh, we have to put that in sequence. So you have to have in your head a script of how you could explain these two ponds with a street across them in the middle. And you have to explain the wildlife like geese and ducks and herons and uh, squirrels and all sorts of other insects. And uh, putting this together takes perhaps 3 hours. And then David Witsani will come this afternoon and we'll try to put some of this together. That's the sort of thing that it has made it helpful to us next door to Weft to explain what we're doing with Prairie. The Prairie is down to very little left and it's only along railroad lines. And so we buy up old railroad beds with the hope of preserving some of the dignity of the original prairie which came to us. And that requires the talent of different people to do the broadcast, to put this up on YouTube, to program things, and it's a leadership that's involved. So if you go back to Britain and the Wessex and the King in Charge, you're looking for this sort of takeoff. And it may take off in internet terms. One event may go viral and be seen by people around the world. But there's also the events that don't do that. It's very silent in the background. You have to have legal background. You have to have membership, and some of the things we do are by the seat of the pants, and they don't really fit into a law paradigm. Law is concerned with liability. So if you're going to re-rail between Whiteheath and Seymour, there are XXX number of liabilities that would be involved in providing an easement for Champaign, Havana, and Western historic railroad that we hope will take historic trains from the Monticello Railroad Museum into Champaign. That is an amazing almost invasion of regularity. That's a rather extreme sort, but there are railroad engineers and people who have one foot in the Railroad Museum that are quite willing to do that in cooperation with Heartland Pathways. We get the prairie that's on the edge, the railroad gets the ballast and re-rails, and so we have rails and ties already uh, starting to do that. It's going to take us years to do it, perhaps. But if you have a file in your closet that outlines what you want to do, then it may be that grant money might help you to do that in a very much shorter time. Uh, so I don't know how to express this, but when you are looking to do this, you tend to want to find the agencies that are established who have rules of the game and have attorneys. The Chicago area has open space and they have endless attorneys and they have professional CEOs and professional people who know how to bring people together. That's another skill. They have artists, and uh, that's a part of what Prairie State Conservation Coalition has been doing. Fran Hardy and others got together probably about 10 years ago, and they put together this organization which has uh, the elements of educating people, but also basically to bring people together and then to go to the state to ask about certain environmental regulations that uh, are bothering it. Some of them where, for instance, uh, people would get a tax break for keeping a forest, but then that tax break was removed, and so to get it back is a question. So many years ago, there was a move to create an environmental agency, and it there was a huge argument about whether this should be a political cat or whether it should be organized for science teachers and biologists. And there was a split. So now we have a environmental council in Springfield. It's uh, run by Jennifer Walling, and it's a very political cat. And it can come to and get help from groups like the Prairie State Conservation Coalition. And the other arm went off and became more or less a science teacher oriented organization. And those two organizations have split but become stronger because of their specialization. In the wings somewhere, there are people like ourselves who spin off agencies or work with agencies and then are left with some of the things that are not so easy to work with. It's not always something that is viable for a court. It may have farmers around a little trail, abandoned railroad bed. In our case, we have been very fortunate to have most farmers are very respectful of our right to own a property and so not to invade it. There are other farmers who crib in from each side and think that this is land that's not being worked, and so it is uh, legitimate to invade it, uh, encroach. That's not exactly true. Uh, Conservation is a land use, so that invasion can be loose or it can be very tight. It has laws that go with it, and you create easements to make sure that the conservation principle is retained. We've done that in several different ways. The early on, we uh, looked at an abandoned railroad between Cisco and Monticello. The Railroad Museum bought 7 miles between Monticello and Whiteheath, and we bought between Whiteheath and Seymour and Whiteheath and Clinton. And we were lucky enough to buy soon enough that only one bridge was removed before we got to the act of doing it. There was no rail to trail movement at a national level that's now running across the country with thousands of miles of rail trails. And there was, so we were inspiring a thought process that was kind of ridiculous in some places. But there was Mrs. Price who wanted to preserve a bridge and put money in. And there were others that came forth with $5 here. And gradually Illinois Central was kind of amazed. We sat there in Chicago for days when they thought that these here were people who have no money and they want to buy a railroad line. And we got something like 6 months to buy, and we got the money. And that is inspirational. So then you need to be able to report that to people who don't exactly know what you're talking about. So it's but that takes talent. That takes planners, people who are able to predict the future and match their skills to it, like all the malls in Champaign and other cities. It happens quickly. You might be involved in politics, which thinks this is the most ideal thing that ever happened. Yet after 50 years, those malls are beginning to break up and come back to the towns and gentrify the towns. So things change, and you need leaders that are able to dance that tune and understand the emotions that are involved. You need to know the people. I just went to a hospital setting. I have some allergy problems, and I talked to the people partially because I think there's an era of medical assessment that includes a lot of people's mental background, and they're getting to know each other. It used to be that the doctor was an authority, but now the doctor is a part of a team. And how do you do that? So I talked to Abigail and asked her how she got that name, and she looked and she said her mother is from Scotland, and if you look on her tag, her spelling of her name has an AEL on the end, which is different from the way you spell it here. And just that conversation led to an understanding of people who, why are they there? They're there to help people understand each other, and sometimes it's fairly traumatic. You might just be diagnosing cancer or something like that. And then right next to Abigail is a black lady who is obviously very skilled in these things. I had to make an appointment, and I gave her my cell phone so that she could put the information in. I've got used to over the years having a little booklet, and that's not. That's, no more do they print the booklet. You can't get it, so you have to find a substitute booklet, which I have, which is large, and it doesn't fit in my pocket just the same way. So you have to have it on your cell phone, which is best, but you have to go through the learning process to do that. But I'm talking to the doctor. He wonders why I'm working in allergenic situations. Well, yes, we have an old storefront, and it looks like a country cousin, and we have to neat and tidy it, and it has dust mites. and the dust mites are very, very small, and they can get into your chest and create havoc, and then you can't breathe. So uh, we have to understand that and figure out what we can do to survive in this total setting. Uh, it might be limited by the money that's available, or the willingness of trying to work with parts of your mission that might be not the low-hanging fruit. It's, it's easier, for instance, for people to do forestry preservation than it is to do prairie preservation, because in the first place, there's no prairie left. So it is very, very ticklish to go to an abandoned railroad bed between uh, uh, Bloomington and Farmer City and Mansfield and say, we don't want quite a wider trail. We want to preserve the 0.001% of the prairie that we have left along the line. So that takes someone who's prepared to know what they're talking about and go to the various counties and ask or beg for a narrower trail. Then you have to talk to the ADA, the uh, the people who are disability associates, and you have to go to EPA, and there are all manner of dreams that are legal. That, like, is there creosote left in the trail? You have to balance one against the other. Do you leave a little creosote, or do you put 8 inches of gravel on top of the creosote to cap it? And that makes the trail wide. So this week I opened up the Journal Republic, which is the News Gazette counterpart of the Rantoul paper that I was talking about. And there's a picture of a ceramic goose looking over a trail, and a nice little statement about the trail itself was a, a mile long, and then by popular demand, it was extended another mile, and Monticello paid for the for this to be created, because we did this before there was a rail banking act that has given the Kickapoo Trail something like $12 million, plus state money, plus local money. So Monticello did it themselves. We asked if they would help us to buy. They didn't want to do that. Often we have to do the raw start, and that was the case of the Kickapoo Trail. We took out the injunction with the Surface Transportation Board in Washington to establish our thought to have a trail and prairie on either side from Urbana to Danville. So the one in Monticello is creative at the local level. It goes over the Sangamon River on a truss bridge. We still own the railroad bed, and it's an easement, and the trail is narrower. It's 8 feet wide, and there's room for a ceramic goose to be sitting on the side. The extension has been country rock, still rideable by bicycles and walking, but it's been there for about a year waiting for it to be surfaced, and I think it's something like 63,000 was assigned to surfacing it, and they put in asphalt, and you have to wonder about who did decide to do asphalt. Asphalt is not as simple as concrete. Concrete, you can take your own organization and repair it. So if a root of a tree gets underneath and lifts up piece of concrete and creates a tripper, then you can replace it yourself. If you do asphalt, you have to have a asphalt team come in with a heated tire, and you have to call in. So that's an external job, but it's been done, and that's what the little article was about, to say, hey, we did this. They don't exactly know where it was created, how it got to be a trail in the first place, but that's sort of what we do in the background, and it's very hard to convince people to help with this, because you have to have the skills to do uh, computer work, to put pictures together, and so we try. And I think it's wonderful that the Prairie State Conservation Coalition is having webinars about the topic of leadership. They first of all want to know, what do you know about yourself? What do you want to do? Do you want to be just the person who delivers meals in retirement to retirement people, or do you want to think beautiful thoughts about what goes on in other places, and how do they do it, and how do people get the inspiration to climb a mountain? And so I'm watching the clock, and I want to leave enough space for Weft and Gina to add something that is a promotional, so that you can go see the sign on Lincoln Avenue in University, so that you can come to a Zoomed festival or WebFest, so that you can contribute with a fundraiser, so that you can help to put up a radio tower. So you can bring all these things together in a tremendously friendly manner. And so I'm going to close now. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And think about doing some leadership work. Bye-bye.